The courtroom falls silent as the judge's gavel strikes the wooden block. 66-year-old Daniel Rigg, decorated Marine sniper, sits in handcuffs while the jury deliberates his fate for charges that should never have been filed. Outside, protesters chant for justice, their voices echoing through the concrete halls. What they don't know is that in 12 minutes a military helicopter will land on the courthouse steps carrying General Samuel Wyatt, the one man who can save him and reveal the truth that's been buried for 50 years. But will he arrive in time to prevent the greatest injustice of Rigg's life? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and redemption, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe that true heroes deserve recognition regardless of their race, please hit that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow's special episode reveals shocking government secrets you definitely don't want to miss. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Rigg sat alone in Murphy's Diner on East Washington Street in downtown Indianapolis. The 66-year-old Marine veteran maintained his military posture even in the war and vinyl booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Silver threads ran through his closely cropped beard, and despite the early morning hour of 6 a.m. he was already dressed in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt. His faded Marine Corps cap sat on the table beside a folded copy of the Indianapolis Star. The diner was nearly empty except for a few construction workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts. Daniel preferred these quiet morning hours, a routine he'd maintained for 15 years since retiring from his job as a community college history instructor. The Purple Heart medal pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent light as he turned the newspaper pages, reading about local politics and community events with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to scanning enemy territory through a rifle scope. At 6:15 a.m. the bell above the diner chimed as 3 white teenagers stumbled in their clothes reeking of alcohol and marijuana from what was obviously an all-night party. Tyler Morrison, a 19-year-old college dropout with bleached hair and expensive sneakers, led the group to a booth near Daniel's table. His companions, Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins, both 18 and clearly from wealthy families based on their designer clothes, followed with the swagger of young men who'd never faced real consequences. "Look at this old black dude taking up space," Tyler announced loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably been sitting here all night nursing one cup of coffee like they always do." Daniel looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm but alert. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Maria Rodriguez, the waitress who'd served Daniel for years, shot an apologetic look from behind the counter but continued wiping down glasses with nervous energy. "Man, I bet he's one of those welfare cases," Jake added, sliding into the booth. "My dad says they just hang out in places like this because they got nowhere else to go." Daniel folded his newspaper carefully and set it aside. "Gentlemen," he said in a quiet, measured voice that carried decades of military authority, "I'm not looking for any trouble. Perhaps you could keep your voices down so everyone can enjoy their breakfast." The request was polite, reasonable, and delivered with the kind of respect Daniel had learned in the Marines, but Tyler's face flushed red with anger and something else Daniel recognized from his years in combat zones, the kind of privileged rage that comes from being challenged by someone you consider beneath you. "Did this old man just tell us what to do?" Tyler stood up, his voice rising to attract attention from everyone in the diner. "Did this threatening old black guy just try to intimidate us?" Daniel remained seated, his hands visible on the table, making no aggressive moves whatsoever. "I simply asked you to lower your voices, nothing more." "He's threatening us." Brett jumped up, pulling out his phone to start recording. "This crazy veteran is threatening innocent people. Someone call the police." Maria stepped forward from behind the counter. "That's not what happened. Mr. Rigg was just asking them to be quiet. He didn't threaten anyone." But Tyler was already on his phone with 911, his voice taking on a panic tone that would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. "Help, there's a dangerous black man at Murphy's Diner threatening to hurt us. He looks like he might have weapons. Please hurry." Daniel felt a familiar chill run down his spine, the same sensation he'd experienced in Vietnam when he realized he was walking into an ambush. He'd survived 3 tours of duty, earned a Silver Star and Purple Heart, and taught thousands of students about American history and values. But in this moment, in a diner where he'd been a regular customer for over a decade, he knew he was facing a different kind of warfare. Within 4 minutes, 3 police cruisers arrived with sirens blaring. Officers Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh burst through the door with their hands on their weapons, immediately scanning the room for threats, their eyes locked onto Daniel, the only black person in the establishment, and their bodied language shifted into aggressive mode. "That's him." Tyler pointed dramatically at Daniel, who remained seated with his hands visible. "He threatened to hurt us, said he knew ways to make people disappear." Daniel had said no such thing, but the officers didn't bother to ask for his side of the story. Officer Patterson, a 15-year veteran with a documented history of complaints from minority communities, approached Daniel's table with his hand resting on his service weapon. "Stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back," Patterson commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that bore no argument. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding." Daniel began rising slowly from his seat. "I simply asked these young men to lower their voices. I made no threats of any kind." "Save it for the judge," Patterson snapped roughly, grabbing Daniel's arms and forcing them behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked shut with unnecessary force, pinching the skin on Daniel's wrists. "You're under arrest for terroristic threatening and disturbing the peace." Maria tried to intervene again. "Officers, I saw everything. Mr. Rigg didn't threaten anyone. These boys were drunk and causing trouble. He was just trying to eat his breakfast in peace." Officer Walsh turned on the waitress with a dismissive wave. "Ma'am, we need you to step back and let us do our job. We have multiple witnesses saying this man made threats." The multiple witnesses were the 3 teenagers who had fabricated the entire incident, but their word carried more weight than the truth. Daniel's Purple Heart medal visible on his jacket might as well have been invisible to the officers, who saw only a black man accused by white victims as they led Daniel toward the police car. His Marine Corps cap fell to the floor of the diner, landing beside the newspaper he'd been reading peacefully just minutes before. The headline visible on the open page read, "Local veterans honored for service." A bitter irony that wasn't lost on the man now being treated like a common criminal. The ride to the Marin County Jail took 12 minutes, during which officers Patterson and Walsh discussed Daniel as if he weren't sitting in the back seat. They speculated about his criminal history and wondered aloud whether he might be one of those unstable veterans they'd been warned about in training. Daniel said nothing, knowing from experience that silence was often the wisest course when facing overwhelming force at the jail. Daniel was processed like any other suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph snapped for the mug shot that would later appear on evening news broadcasts across Indianapolis. His personal effects were cataloged and stored: wallet containing $43, house keys, and a worn photograph of his late wife Sarah and their daughter Michelle. His Purple Heart medal was noted as decorative pin on the property sheet. The charges were filed within 2 hours. Terroristic threatening in the second degree and disturbing the peace. Bail was set at $50. An amount that would require Daniel to put up his house as collateral for a man living on a modest military pension and Social Security. It might as well have been $50 million. By evening the story had reached local news stations. Channel 8 led with "Veteran threatens teens at downtown diner," showing Daniel's mug shot alongside smiling school photos of Tyler, Jake and Brett. The narrative was set before Daniel even had a chance to speak with a lawyer. "Dangerous black veteran terrorizes innocent white college students." The fact that the victims were drunk, disorderly and had fabricated the entire incident was lost in the rush to broadcast breaking news. Daniel spent his first night in county jail in a cell with 2 other men awaiting trial. As he lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but think about the country he'd served for 4 years in Vietnam, the students he'd taught about justice and equality, and the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. Somewhere in the darkness he wondered if the America he'd fought for had ever really existed, or if it had always been a dream deferred for people who looked like him. The Marin County Superior Court had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the prosecution of Daniel Rigg brought out a level of media attention that surprised even veteran court observers. By the time Daniel's arraignment took place 3 days after his arrest, protesters had gathered on both sides of the courthouse steps, creating a volatile atmosphere that required additional security. Daniel's court-appointed attorney Jennifer Walsh, not to be confused with the arresting officer, was a recent law school graduate working her first year in the public defender's office. With a caseload of over 100 active cases, she had approximately 40 minutes to review Daniel's file before their first meeting in the concrete interview room at the county jail. "Mr. Rigg, I've looked over the charges against you. She began flipping through pages that contained more gaps than actual investigation. The state has 3 witnesses who say you threatened them with violence. That's going to be difficult to overcome. Daniel sat across from her in his orange jumpsuit, maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. Walsh, I never threatened those young men. I asked them politely to lower their voices. That's all that happened. I understand that's your version of events, she replied, already sounding defeated, but we have to be realistic about what we're facing here. District Attorney Rebecca Carlisle is prosecuting this case personally, which means she sees it as a high-priority conviction. What Daniel didn't know was that Rebecca Carlisle was running for mayor on a tough-on-crime platform, and his case had become a centerpiece of her campaign strategy. Local polls showed her trailing her opponent by 8 points, but a high-profile conviction of a dangerous veteran could shift public opinion in her favor. The preliminary hearing took place in Judge Robert Morrison's courtroom, a wood-paneled chamber that had hosted Indianapolis justice for over 60 years. Judge Morrison, a white man in his early 70s, had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom, but his efficiency often came at the expense of thorough examination of evidence. Jury selection proved to be the first major obstacle for Daniel's defense. The jury pool was drawn from Marin County voter rolls, which skewed heavily towards suburban areas with predominantly white populations. Potential jurors were asked basic questions about their ability to be impartial, but deeper questions about racial bias were deemed irrelevant by Judge Morrison. The final jury consisted of 10 white jurors, 1 Hispanic woman and 1 black man who worked as a security guard during Vordia. Several potential jurors had openly expressed skepticism about veterans, particularly those who had served in Vietnam. Those guys came back messed up, one dismissed juror had said. You never know what might set them off. Media coverage of the jury selection process focused heavily on Daniel's military background, but not in the way that might have helped his case. Channel 8's legal analyst, former prosecutor David Kelly, appeared on the evening news to discuss the unique challenges of prosecuting veterans. Veterans with combat experience can be unpredictable. Kelly explained to viewers they're trained killers who've seen violence most of us can't imagine when they feel threatened or cornered. The training can kick in with dangerous results. The fact that Daniel had served his country with honor, earned decorations for bravery, and spent 30 years teaching American history to community college students was mentioned only in passing. The narrative had already been established. Dangerous veteran threatens innocent civilians. 3 days before the trial began, Daniel's daughter Michelle drove down from Chicago, where she worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She'd taken unpaid leave to attend her father's trial despite the financial hardship it represented for her family. Dad, I found a private attorney who might take the case, she told him during visiting hours at the county jail. Gerald Watson has experience with discrimination cases. He thinks we might have grounds for a civil rights lawsuit. After this is over, Daniel shook his head slowly. Michelle, honey, I can't ask you to spend money you don't have. Mr. Watson probably charges more in an hour than I get in Social Security all month. This isn't about money, Dad. This is about justice. You served this country for 4 years. You taught students about the Constitution and civil rights for 3 decades. You don't deserve this. But justice, as Daniel was learning, was often a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Private attorneys required retainers that started at $25. Money that neither Daniel nor his daughter possessed. The media circus intensified as the trial date approached. Local news stations ran nightly segments about the case, almost always leading with Daniel's mugshot and referring to him as the accused veteran. Tyler Morrison's family hired a public relations firm to handle media requests, ensuring that their son was portrayed as a victim of veteran violence rather than a privileged teenager who had fabricated criminal charges. One particularly damaging piece aired on Channel 13's evening newscast 3 days before trial. The segment, titled "One Veteran's Attack," featured interviews with psychiatrists who had never met Daniel but were willing to speculate about the underlying trauma that might drive a veteran to threaten civilians. Vietnam veterans in particular carry psychological scars that may not manifest for decades, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who specialized in PTSD. A seemingly minor confrontation can trigger flashbacks too. combat situations, causing those individuals to perceive threats where none exist. The segment showed stock footage of Vietnam War combat while discussing Daniel's case, creating a visual association between his situation and wartime violence. No mention was made of Daniel's peaceful 30-year career as an educator, his volunteer work with literacy programs, or his spotless criminal record. Meanwhile, the three accusers were portrayed as innocent victims whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter with Daniel. Tyler Morrison appeared on multiple talk shows describing his terror at being threatened by a trained killer who looked like he could snap at any moment. The courthouse itself became a daily gathering point for protesters representing both sides of the case. Military veterans who had heard about Daniel's situation drove from across the Midwest to show support, standing in silent formation wearing their service uniforms and holding signs reading "Honor our veterans and justice for Daniel Rigg." On the opposite side of the courthouse steps, members of various community groups carried signs demanding safety from violent veterans and "Protect our children." The two groups maintained an uneasy distance, separated by police barriers and watched closely by officers who feared the situation might explode into violence. Local politicians quickly chose sides based on their electoral calculations. Mayor James Harrison, a Democrat facing re-election, issued a statement calling for calm and respect for the judicial process. His Republican challenger Susan Martinez held a press conference demanding maximum penalties for anyone who threatens our young people. The stage was set for a trial that had less to do with determining Daniel Rigg's guilt or innocence than with satisfying the political and social agendas of people who saw his case as a symbol of larger cultural battles in this circus atmosphere. The truth of what had happened in Murphy's Diner on that quiet morning seemed almost irrelevant, as Daniel prepared for trial in his county jail cell reading legal documents by the fluorescent light that never dimmed. He found himself thinking about the young Marines he'd served with in Vietnam. Many of them hadn't made it home. Those who had returned often faced a hostile reception from a country that seemed ashamed of the war they'd been ordered to fight. Now, 50 years later, Daniel was discovering that his service still carried no weight when measured against the accusations of three privileged teenagers who had never sacrificed anything for their country. The Purple Heart medal that had meant so much to him was sitting in a property envelope reduced to evidence in a case that threatened to destroy the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. District Attorney Rebecca Carl strode into the Marin County Superior Courtroom wearing a navy blue suit that conveyed both authority and sympathy, a calculated choice designed to appeal to the jury. She would spend the next week trying to convince. Her opening statement lasted 42 minutes and painted Daniel Rigg not as a decorated veteran but as a dangerous predator who had used his military training to terrorize innocent young men. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Carol began making eye contact with each juror in turn. We are here today because the defendant Daniel Rigg, a man trained in violence and killing, chose to threaten three young men whose only crime was enjoying a meal at a local restaurant. She gestured toward Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins, who sat in the front row dressed in conservative suits and ties, their parents flanking them like protective shields. These three young men will tell you about the fear they experienced when this defendant, a trained sniper with decades of weapons experience, made it clear that he could hurt them in ways they couldn't imagine. Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh started to object to the characterization, but Judge Morrison waved her down before she could speak. The prosecutor will confine her statements to evidence that will be presented, he said mildly, a warning that carried no real teeth. Carl's strategy became clear as she called her first witness Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist from Indiana University who specialized in what he termed late-onset veteran violence. Dr. Webb had never met Daniel, never reviewed his military records, and had no direct knowledge of the case, but his credentials impressed the jury. Dr. Webb, in your professional opinion, are older veterans more likely to engage in threatening behavior than the general population? Carol asked. Absolutely, Webb replied without hesitation. Veterans, particularly those who served in combat zones like Vietnam, carry what we call trained lethality. Unlike civilian criminals who might threaten violence they can't actually carry out, these individuals possess the skills and psychological conditioning to follow through on their threats. Jennifer Walsh rose to object. Your Honor, this witness has no knowledge of my client's specific case or psychological state. Sustained. Judge Morrison ruled, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard an expert witness essentially declare that veterans like Daniel were inherently more dangerous than other people. The prosecution's case built systematically over 3 days, each witness adding another layer to the narrative of Daniel as a threatening figure Tyler Morrison took the stand first, his testimony polished through hours of preparation with Carlisle's team. He looked at us with these cold, calculating eyes, Tyler said, dabbing at tears that appeared on cue. It was like he was deciding the best way to hurt us. Then he said, and I'll never forget these words, young men like you need to learn respect, and I know ways to teach it that you'll never forget. Daniel had never said anything remotely similar, but Tyler delivered the fabricated quote with such conviction the two jurors visibly recoiled. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins followed with supporting testimony that corroborated Tyler's lies, their stories rehearsed to eliminate the contradictions that had appeared in their initial police statements. The defendant kept talking about his military training. Jake testified he said he'd been in situations where he had to make people disappear and that local police couldn't protect us if he decided we needed to be taught a lesson. Again, pure fabrication, but delivered with the earnestness of youth supposedly traumatized by encounter with violence. Brett Collins added the final touches to their fictional narrative. When Mr. Riggs stood up, I could see he was evaluating us like targets. Brett said he mentioned that he still had connections in the military, people who knew how to handle problems quietly. We were terrified. Carroll reinforced these testimonies by calling Officer Michael Patterson to the stand. Patterson, the arresting officer, embellished his police report significantly. During his testimony when we arrived at the diner, the defendant was agitated and belligerent. Patterson testified he kept mentioning his military service and making failed references to his combat experience. We had to restrain him because he appeared ready to escalate the situation. Jennifer Walsh knew this was false. Daniel had been completely cooperative during his arrest, but she lacked the resources to investigate Patterson's history of misconduct or challenge his testimony effectively. The prosecution's masterstroke came when Carlisle called Drive Patricia Harris, a psychiatrist who had never treated Daniel but claimed expertise in veteran-related violence. Drive Hendricks testified that Vietnam veterans often experienced delayed onset aggressive episodes triggered by perceived disrespect from younger generations. The defendant's military service, particularly as a sniper, would have conditioned him to respond to threats with calculated violence. Dr. Hicks explained when these young men inadvertently triggered his psychological conditioning, he reverted to his military training and began assessing them as potential targets for elimination. The testimony was devastating because it sounded scientific and authoritative, even though it was based on no examination of Daniel and contradicted by decades of research showing that veterans were not more violent than the general population. But the jury heard a doctor with impressive credentials declaring that Daniel's military service made him inherently dangerous. Carl's closing argument tied together all these threads into a narrative of inevitable violence, narrowly averted. The defendant is a trained killer who saw three young men enjoying themselves and decided they needed to be taught a lesson through intimidation and fear. She told the jury, if not for the quick action of these brave young men in calling police, we might be here today discussing assault or worse. She paused dramatically, looking at each juror. Daniel Rigg may have served his country decades ago, but that service does not give him the right to terrorize civilians today. Your verdict must send a clear message that this community will not tolerate veterans who use their training to threaten innocent people. Throughout the prosecution's case, Daniel sat at the defense table maintaining the same dignity he'd carried through combat, imprisonment, and now trial. He watched as his military service, the thing he was most proud of in his life, was twisted into evidence of his supposed dangerousness. The Purple Heart he'd earned saving his squad from enemy fire was portrayed as proof that he was capable of violence. The Silver Star citation gathering dust in his closet told a story of heroism, but the jury would never hear it. The most painful moment came when Carl displayed Daniel's military ID photograph from Vietnam on the courtroom's large screen. Look at this image, she told the jury. This is a young man trained to kill efficiently and without remorse. That training doesn't disappear with age, it lies dormant waiting for the right trigger. The photograph showed 19-year-old Daniel in his Marine dress uniform, proud and hopeful, ready to serve his country with honor. 50 years later, that same image was being used to convince a jury that he was a threat to society. As the prosecution rested its case, Daniel felt a familiar sensation from his Vietnam days, the knowledge that he was surrounded by enemy forces with no clear path to safety, but this time there would be no helicopter extraction, no supporting fire from friendly forces. This time he was truly alone. Comment number 1: if you believe that a veteran's service record should be considered during trial. Or comment number 2: if you think past military service is irrelevant to criminal charges. Don't forget to hit that like button if you support fair treatment for all veterans, and make sure to subscribe because you won't believe what happens when the truth finally comes to light. Will Daniel's defense be able to counter the prosecution's character assassination? Can 3 decades of honorable civilian life outweigh fabricated testimony from privileged accusers? The next part of this story will shock you with revelations that change everything. Jennifer Walsh's defense of Daniel Rigg began with the kind of systematic disadvantages that plague public defenders across America. Too many cases, too little time, and resources stretched so thin they might as well be non-existent. As she stood to present her opening statement, Walsh carried a briefcase containing exactly 37 pages of notes about Daniel's case compared to the prosecution's 3 boxes of prepared materials. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh began, her voice lacking the confident authority that had characterized Carl's presentation. My client Daniel Rigg is not the dangerous predator the prosecution wants you to believe. He's a 66-year-old retired teacher who simply asked some disruptive teenagers to lower their voices. It was a weak opening and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Walsh hadn't been able to investigate the backgrounds of the 3 accusers, hadn't uncovered their history of minor legal troubles, and most critically hadn't been granted access to Daniel's military service records that might have shown the jury the kind of man he really was. The first major blow came when Judge Morrison ruled that Daniel's military records were irrelevant to the current charges and therefore inadmissible. This decision eliminated Walsh's ability to present evidence of Daniel's Silver Star, Purple Heart, and commendations for valor that might have countered the prosecution's portrayal of him as inherently dangerous. Your Honor, Walsh had argued during a sidebar conference, my client's military service record directly contradicts the state's characterization of him as an unstable veteran prone to violence. These records show 30 years of exemplary service to his country. Ms. Walsh, Judge Morrison replied with barely concealed impatience, we're not trying your client's military service, we're trying the specific charges brought against him in this courtroom. His war record, whatever it may contain, has no bearing on whether he threatened 3 young men in a diner. The ruling was devastating because it allowed the prosecution to reference Daniel's military training as evidence of his capacity for violence while preventing the defense from showing that same service had been characterized by honor, sacrifice, and protection of others. It was like being allowed to mention that someone owned a gun while being forbidden from explaining they were a police officer. Walsh's attempts to present character witnesses met similar obstacles. Daniel's former students from Moron Community College, where he had taught American history for 30 years, were eager to testify about his character, patience, and dedication to helping young people understand their country's struggles with justice and equality. But Judge Morrison ruled that character witnesses were cumulative and limited Walsh to just 2. The first character witness was Dr. Margaret Chen, Daniel's former department head at the community college. Dr. Chen, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s, testified that Daniel had been one of the most respected faculty members in her 4 decades at the college. Professor Rigg was beloved by his students. Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to education and 30 years of teaching. I never received a single complaint about his conduct. Students often told me that his classes changed their perspectives on American history and civil rights, but Carl's cross-examination quickly turned Dr. Chen's testimony against Daniel. Dr. Chen, were you aware that Professor Rigg frequently discussed violence in his classes? He taught about historical violence, yes, the Civil War, both World Wars, Vietnam, and did he ever discuss his personal experiences with violence? Dr. Chen hesitated, suddenly understanding the trap he caught.